What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and in this video we're working on the 96 Toyota Camry station wagon again. This is the V6, the 1MZ-FE, and in this video we're replacing the timing belt as well as the water pump. I have a whole kit, tensioner, idler pulleys, everything, and obviously the coolant. So let's get started. So to start doing the timing belt, let's pop the hood, jack up the car, and get the drive belts off. Let's first remove the alternator and AC belt. Unlock this tensioner bolt. Well, it's not really a tensioner, it's a tensioning bolt. You move the alternator and it puts tension on the belt, but it stays locked, so you have to break that bottom one free. Alright, so break this free first. If you can't break it free with something small, you can use a larger tool with more leverage. You don't have to take it all the way out. Next, you want to loosen this bolt, and that's gonna loosen up the belt. One last bolt to undo so the alternator can pivot is this one up here. Okay, you don't have to take this all the way out, just break it free. As you can see, the belt's getting looser. Okay, now you can slip the belt off once it's loose enough. Take it off the crank, take it off the AC. And to get off the power steering belt, we're actually going to have to jack up the car. To jack it up, I'm going to go right here. That's the front of the front subframe, and that's where you jack it up to get the whole front end up evenly. Next, you want to take off the passenger side wheel. And you want to take this splash shield off with two 10mm bolts. So you want to loosen up this 12mm bolt. This one can be pretty tight. There's actually another bolt right here, and I didn't realize that because mine was already loose. Someone had left it loose, and unfortunately, so did I, so I went back and fixed it after the video. Make sure you take off the bolt that's in there. You can reach it with a deep socket through this hole in the power steering pump pulley. Just break it free. It's just a bolt that basically allows the pump to pivot on that bolt. And that bolt is just a bolt that you have to loosen up. You don't have to take out or anything. It's just a pivot bolt. And when you have loosened the top and the bottom bolt, only then can you pivot the power steering pump. Now with that loose, you can just pull down on the belt. Okay, so if you reach up here, pry down on the power steering pump, that should give you enough slack to start taking off the belt. Okay, so if you can do this by hand, go ahead, but I used a pry bar, put it back there, pry this so it can take tension off the belt. Use a second pry bar, put it on this part of the belt, and just work it so that the belt comes off. Alright, so mine broke, so I could have just cut it. You can just cut it to begin with, but I was hoping to take it off the gentle way first. Drain the coolant from the radiator. Make sure it's cool to the touch, and then down underneath you're gonna have the petcock. You can't see it because it's underneath this fan, but if you go underneath, if you can reach it and open it like this, there's a hole right here that it's gonna drain through. If not, which is my case, I can't really reach it very well, I'm gonna remove the splash shield and get access to the petcock that way. These should all be 10mm. That should be enough to get to the petcock, which is right here. So grab pliers, unless you can do this by hand, but most likely it's going to be tight. Use your pliers, break it free, and then with a drain pan, drain your coolant. I'm going to start simple. Remove your coolant overflow tank. At this point you can also open your radiator cap so the coolant can drain faster. That way air goes into here while it's draining down there. Set this aside. You can take this hose off because we'll need access everywhere here. Next, disconnect your two ground straps here Toyota was nice enough to put a disconnect for you, so you don't have to unbolt it. And the next thing is going to be to remove this motor mount so we can get access to everything else. Start by disconnecting this. Okay, so I thought I could remove this mount without taking this out by just pulling the whole assembly out. Turns out I can't. So I'm gonna have to remove this bolt here, and clearly this engine mount is garbage. So for me, someone replaced this rear bolt with an average hardware store bolt, so there's a nut on the bottom. There shouldn't be. Get this 12mm bolt out. Now, you should be able to pull this up. Just like that. I like to put my hardware back where it came from. That way I'm less likely to forget where it goes. So I want to get this wiring harness out of my way. It has, this clip is broken, but there's a little tab that you pull and this pops off. Same over here. You can see there's a very small tab that you pry on. And same up here. And in the back, there is a hidden 10mm screw. You want to take that off. That's what secures the rest of your wiring harness. I'm going to move this wiring harness back. This is the timing belt cover. And I want to push this back so I have room. Take this diagnostic port off so that I can do this. Use a bungee cord. I'm going to hang it on the wiper arm over here. And although it might look like it's very stretched, it's really not. It's just holding it out of my way. And now let's get the timing cover off with 10mm socket. Get all the bolts off. So there's one up here. I have two missing here from whenever the last timing belt was done. There is one back here. So there's one bolt in here. It's hidden. You'll need a small extension. Okay, that one's out. There's another bolt right here underneath this plate for the motor mount. Alright, so that was it. 6 bolts in total. I was missing 2 of them. And the upper timing belt cover can now come off. For this, I strongly recommend a powerful impact, whether it's electric or pneumatic. If not, there are other methods to take off the crank pulley bolt. One that I can think of is to put a breaker bar on it up against the ground and have someone hit the starter so that it breaks this loose. But the best way to do it is with a powerful impact. Keep in mind, when you're undoing it, the engine, with an impact, the engine wants to spin backwards, which is not good, so that's why you want something powerful. That way it doesn't actually spin backwards, it just breaks it free. So the next step, once this is loose, if you've taken it out already, put it back about halfway. And the reason that is because we'll need a crank pulley or a pulley puller, which you can rent from your local auto parts store for free. The one I rented looks like this. It has these teeth here that hook onto the pulley, and you can tighten them, adjust them widthwise, and then you use this to push in on the center bolt and it pulls the pulley out. So the way I'm going to install it is line up this bolt in the middle with your crank bolt, snug up the side clamps that hold onto the pulley, make sure it's seated so that it doesn't break the pulley. So once you have tightened up this rod that adjusts the sides, make sure you make it snug. And make sure it's seated inside of the grooves of the pulley, otherwise it'll break them. And then tighten up the center bolt. I don't recommend using an impact when you do this, because then you can't feel what's happening in case something's stripping or breaking. Once it starts getting easier, you know that the pulley's at the end, and then you can back your tool off, take it out, and then do the rest by hand. Take off the center bolt. And at this point, you should be able to slide it off by hand. And that's what you don't want. So once that's off, down here there are 3 10mm bolts, one of which I can easily get to with my electric impact. And then the 2 other ones are up higher. One is right here by the power steering pump. This is the second one. And the last one is up front here, which is hard to see because it's in a little crevice. Okay, and once that one's out, the whole lower timing cover can come off. So the next step is to take off this unit that holds the motor mount. This actually comes off the block, and that's the last thing that we need to do before we set the timing to top dead center and remove the belt. So to do that, you are going to have to remove this bracket here that attaches the alternator. You don't have to remove this 14mm bolt, but you do have to loosen it enough to where you can slide this bracket out. Then with a 12mm, break this bolt free, or nut, I think it's a nut. Once you take this off, this bracket can slide out. There's a bolt up here. Break this free. Next, there's another bolt, 12mm, right here, right below that first nut that I removed. Break that one free too. Okay, once that's loose, take that one. Okay, leave that one in there. I guess don't take that out. There is, right on the opposite side, on the back side, there's a nut. Break that one free, and then remove it. As you can see, this whole assembly is already starting to move, which is good. Okay, this one's coming out with the whole stud. That's fine. Okay, if your nut comes off the stud, take off the nut. If not, leave the stud in there. So this nut that I initially wanted to put back to keep it here, I actually have to take off with this bracket. Take this bracket off, twist it towards the rear, and then tilt it whichever way you need to tilt it, and get it out of here. Here it is. I will put this nut back here because I don't want to lose it. So the next step is to put the engine at top dead center. Top dead center is when cylinder number 1, which on this engine is the first one on the rear here, is at the top on the compression stroke. Alright, so to line up the cams, you have this line right here that needs to line up with this mark here. Same on the back. You can see there's a white line right there, and then there's a cutout on the back of the timing cover right there. And on the bottom, there's a dot on the crank sprocket right here. That needs to line up with this little raised area on the oil pump. So I recommend doing this with a breaker bar, not a ratchet, because you don't want the engine to spin backwards, and a ratchet will let it spin backwards. So turn it slowly until your marks line up. So before taking the belt completely off, you need to break free. This is if you're replacing the water pump, by the way, which I am. You need to break free these cam bolts because you need to remove the cam sprockets and the rear timing cover so you can get the water pump off. So I put the crank bolt back on and a breaker bar in there, and I have someone holding it while I try to do this. Obviously, if you have a 90-degree impact or a cam holding tool, that's a lot easier. Otherwise, use a breaker bar and wedge it somewhere and just break these free. Okay, so I'm going to start with the front one. These are extremely tight. I'm using my 2-foot breaker bar with a lot of force. Okay, do the same to the rear. Now that these are loose, recheck the timing on your engine, and let's get the timing belt off. Now that it's all lined up perfectly, I'm going to remove the crank pulley bolt. Again, I recommend using an impact for this, and this is because you don't want to move the timing at all. An impact will do it faster than by hand. And the next step is to remove the tensioner bolts to release tension off the belt. Okay, next with a 12mm, remove the tensioner bolts. They are pretty tight, so if you have a long ratchet, that would be helpful. Make sure you take them off evenly, that way nothing breaks or bends by accident. And the second. To take off the tensioner pulley, use a 10mm Allen long ratchet and break it free. Take this off. Don't forget about this washer here, and it sits right here. It helps to space it out away from the block, otherwise the pulley will rub into the block. Next, take off this 10mm bolt. This is just a small retainer for the timing belt on the crank pulley. Now you can slide the belt right off, and up on top, take the belt off. There's your timing belt. Because my kit came with a new idler pulley, I'm going to remove this one so I can replace it. Apparently it's pretty tight. This nut, I have a feeling is going to have to come off, as much as I like to leave hardware in their original spot. And now with the 10mm, go around and break free all the water pump bolts. I'm just going to break them all free first. And once they're all broken free, just go ahead and remove them. Alright, once all of your bolts are out, slowly wiggle the water pump. It's going to make a mess, so make sure you have a collection bucket down there. Let it slowly drain. Remove your cam sprockets. Make sure you remember where they go. Mine are already labeled from the last person that replaced it. And don't worry about marking them, they can only go on one way. Okay, front and back. Next, remove this metal piece right here, the rear timing cover. And now you can remove your timing cover backing. And remove your water pump. Ugh. I have cleaned the area a little bit because it was full of oily junk. Take your old gasket off, throw this away, and now you want to clean off this area with a razor blade or a soft wire brush or something. Just make sure you don't get dirt inside the coolant passages. I always recommend using a brand new razor blade, that way the blade isn't already damaged and it won't scratch up the aluminum surface. And what you want to do is just scrape it until it's clean, that way the new gasket can seal. Once everything is clean, feel it so that you make sure there's no raised areas, that way the gasket can seal up. Make sure there's no dirt that went into these coolant passages. Put your gasket on. That should come with your kit, which I will link down in the description for you. It only goes on one way, so if you have it backwards, you'll know because it won't fit. And install your brand new water pump. Also goes on just one way, so if you have it backwards, it won't fit. Now start in your water pump bolts, and there should be 2 nuts as well. So there should be 4 bolts in total and 2 nuts. I'm going to snug them up in a cross pattern, and then I'm going to torque them. Torque this to 6 foot-pounds. Go in a cross pattern so it can seat properly. Okay, I'm going to go around one more time. Take your old bolt, put it through all the way, and then don't forget this washer that spaces out the pulley properly. And to install it, line it up. Once it's lined up, snug the bolt down and torque it to 25 foot-pounds. Next, install your rear timing cover back on before you put this pulley on. Install all of the mounting bolts and tighten them up. And I'm just going to double check them by hand to make sure they're fully tightened. Now it's time to put the idler pulley back on, the new one that is. Comes with the kit. Again, a link to the kit will be in the description. Snug this up and then torque it to 32 foot-pounds. Next, install your cam sprockets. Again, they only go in one way. This is the alignment mark. Line it up with that. Snug it up, and we will torque it once the belt is on. And do the same to the rear. Next, you want to start lining up your timing belt. I'm going to start on the rear cam pulley. Make sure that all the splines are in. You want to make sure you pull it tight. You want no slack on here. You want it to be tight. Over the front cam sprocket, again, make sure this is tight, not loose. Hold the other side so it doesn't loosen up. Well, as you can see, mine just skipped a tooth, so make sure you tighten it back up. Go underneath. Has to go over the water pump, and I skipped a tooth again on the rear cam sprocket, so tighten it back up. It's very useful if you have a second person to help you do this. Once you're at this point, let's go underneath and put it on the crank pulley, slip it on, and then once it's on there, you want to try and put it over the tensioner. Make sure all your splines are lined up. This should be the slack side. Everything else should have tension. So this does not move. This does not move. It has tension. This is the only area that has slack. And if I pull this tight, this is tight, this is tight, this is loose. So it looks like I'm one tooth off on here, or my timing is off. So right now I'm holding tension down here. I did have the timing belt one tooth off on the crankshaft, and I fixed that. That's why there was slack by the water pump. At this point, you have your brand new tensioner with a little grenade pin in it. You want to leave that in there. Insert the tensioner in place. Put the bolts in. Secure the tensioner. Hold it upwards. While you do this, you want to always have tension on the new belt, otherwise it can skip a tooth again. Okay, while holding pressure on the tensioner so it doesn't fall down, gently snug this up. With a 12mm, snug up your tensioner. Snug it up evenly, so go from one side to the other. Okay, and now we'll torque it. Torque your tensioner bolts to 20 foot-pounds. And once you're sure everything is in place, pull the pin and tension is applied. Once the timing belt's on and tensioned, it's a good idea to spin it several times by hand to make sure that the lines still line up and that everything is where it's supposed to be. So I'm going to go ahead and spin it 3, maybe 4 times. Okay, line up the marks. The cams line up and the crank lines up, so it's all set. To torque the cam sprockets, you have to torque them to 94 foot-pounds. And they do make a tool to hold them, but I'm going to use a screwdriver, put it up against the small bolt to hold the cam. The belt is on, so nothing bad should happen. It's just going to spin over the engine if this doesn't work. But this will help you hold the gear in place. That's 94. Good luck with the rear one. Next, I'm going to install this piece that holds the motor mount on. Remember, I had these 2 bolts that stay with it. Slide it over, start the bolts in. This one on the bottom is a stud, so if yours came out, put it back in. If not, it should just be a nut. and then start in the top bolt and tighten them all down. Okay, make sure these are all very tight. Next, I'm going to install the upper outer timing cover. Start in all the bolts and snug them up. Now that the top timing cover's on, let's get the bottom one on. So remove the crank bolt again. Install your timing belt retainer. Don't forget to put your timing belt retainer here. Toyota puts this here so that in case your timing belt gets loose, it can't skip a tooth on the crank. Make that snug, and then install your lower timing cover. Tighten up your timing cover, make sure it's snug. Next, I'm going to install my motor mount bracket. It has a very small dowel pin down there, make sure it lines up with that. Snug these up. Because someone replaced this bolt for me, I have a nut on the back side, or on the bottom. Reinstall your motor mount. I'm going to unhook my wiring harness now and bring it back to where it belongs. There was this 10mm bolt back here that holds this plastic piece in place. I'll deal with that in a second. Clip all your plastic pieces in so that it holds it. This wiring harness actually goes underneath, I forgot about it. So in order not to remove the whole motor mount assembly, I'm just going to remove this Y bracket here. Put the harness underneath, put this back. Okay, connect your two ground terminals back. Get the coolant overflow back in. Connect your hose back in. Don't forget about the hose clamp. Okay, put your splash shield back once you closed your petcock. Alright, so next I'm going to put on my new harmonic balancer. And I got a new one because my old one was damaged. And if yours is like that, I definitely suggest not reusing it because it will ruin your belt. Slide this on as much as you can by hand. Then you can put your bolt back, bottom it out, and torque it to yep, to that. That's torqued. So I actually forgot earlier to put this bracket back on, and it goes like that. So I'm gonna have to remove this 12mm nut. You gotta take that one off completely, and you wanna slide the bracket onto the alternator bolt like this, and then over that bracket over there. Snug this up. Now let's get the alternator and power steering belts on. Alright, time to reinstall the belts. You're going to start with the power steering belt and start by putting it over the crank because it has to go over the area where the alternator belt goes. Once it's on the pump, you won't have room to stretch it. Then put it over the top of the pump.
You pull down on the pump, you should have just enough slack to slide the belt on. It is a little bit tough to tension it. I'm going to start this tensioner bolt in here. I'm going to get my socket and ratchet ready. And then with a pry bar, I'm going to pry. I'm using the axle to pry, so I'm going to be very gentle, but I'm going to pry the pump away, put some decent force on it, and then snug up this tensioner bolt. Make it tight. and that will lock in the tension for you. To double check the tension, and this works on any belt, you take the longest side of the belt. In this case, they're equal, so it doesn't matter. You want to spin it 90 degrees, and if it takes minimal effort to spin it 90 degrees, you're good. Past 90 degrees, it should not want to spin with minimal effort. It should be tough to spin it past. This one gets up to 90 degrees just about, and then it wants to stop. So this is perfect tension for this. If for some reason your pump is squealing, obviously you have under tightened it and you want to come back and adjust it. If it's too tight, you'll ruin the bearings inside the pump, and then you have to rebuild it or get a new pump. So make sure if it's only spinning like this much and then it wants to stop, that's too much tension. And for the alternator slash AC belt, I'm going to start by sliding it down and under. I'm doing this from above, and I'm going to get it to go past the AC compressor because that's very close to the frame here. All right, once it's passed, I'm just going to slide it on top of the crank pulley. Make sure it's sitting properly on all of the ribs. Slide it over the alternator, and then from underneath, it's easiest to reach to the AC compressor, slide that on all the way. Okay, once your belt is fully engaged on all the ribs, go ahead and tighten up this tensioner bolt to put tension on the belt. And for this, we're going to use the same technique that we used for the bottom, and that is to take the longest side of the belt, which is in this case between the alternator and the harmonic balancer, twist it 90 degrees. If it's easy to twist, then you need to tighten. If it stops at 90 degrees, then you're good. In my case, it wants to stop just a little bit past 90 degrees, so I'm going to tighten a couple more turns. That should be good right there. Oops, I went too much. It's important because otherwise you ruin your bearings. Okay, that's good right there. Next, I'm going to lock the tension on the alternator in with that bolt right there. Okay, snug this up. The last bolt to tighten up here is going to be this main alternator bolt. Okay, make this nice and tight. One of the last things to do is to put this shield back on, and that goes on like this. Next, you want to fill up your cooling system. I'm using universal coolant. You can use Toyota Red, just make sure you flush out whatever's in there. The coolant that came out is actually somewhat fresh. I replaced it about a year or two ago, so it's not very old. If you have one of those coolant funnels that help you bleed the system and not create a mess, use one of those. I don't, so I'm just gonna have to be careful. Now that the coolant system is full, let's start up the car. Turn the heat all the way up. Blower on vents, and put the blower to medium and start up AC off, because you want to know when the fans kick on from heat, and turn on the car. Make sure you look at your gauges. Obviously you've double checked your timing already, everything should be good, but double check that everything is good. You don't get any check engine lights. Make sure you get oil pressure as you should, and pay attention to your temperature gauge the whole time. All right, let's get the wheel on. Now with a little bit of pressure on the wheel, the car's not all the way on the ground yet. I'm gonna torque these. Stock torque is 76 foot-pounds, but my wheels and tires are bigger, so I'm gonna go to 80. Okay, so that basically sums up the timing belt and water pump job. At this point, you've already bled the cooling system, so you want to take your car for a road test. Keep an eye on the temp gauge, make sure it doesn't overheat, and that's about it. Double check your belts, make sure they stay on the ribs here and they don't fall off. Do that as soon as you start up the car. That way they don't go flying and they don't ruin anything else or ruin themselves. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And I will see you in the next one.